All right, give everyone a chance to grab their seats. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jeremiah Aha. I'm the Assistant Director for Wellness Together School Mental Health, and I'll be hosting us today for episode 3 or part 3 of this webinar series entitled Supporting You, Supporting Students, in partnership with the California Department of Education. We're so glad that you're here, and I want to highlight a few things before we jump in. We have a lot of great things in store for you today. Thanks so much for making this a part of your very busy week. And you've likely been serving students and families for quite some time in the midst of transition. This is still relatively new. So I don't think any of us as educators or as support staff signed up for something like this. Nevertheless, we are here and we're going to join together to support each other. So we're so glad you made this a part of your week. So thank you. So I'm going to go through a few important slides here for us. And there'll be 4 links that'll be helpful for you throughout this time. And the links here on the screen, unfortunately, are not clickable. So I'll leave this slide up here for a little bit so that you can maybe open up a tab in your browser and put these links in there through our 2 hours today. The first one's going to be very useful for you even beyond this time. It is going to be a link where all the resources for today's presenters, as well as the part 1 from April 9th and part 2 from last Thursday on April 16th. All the resources there in this folder, just go to bit.ly/ then just think of the name of the webinar series, Supporting You, Supporting Students, bit.ly/supporting you, supporting students. So all presentations, PDFs, supplemental materials, and helpful links will be uploaded into there by the end of the day. So make sure to take a look at that. If maybe you can't stay the entire time with us, we're glad that you're here, even if it is for just a short time. If you have feedback for today's experience or ways that we can serve you better and equip you during this time, visit bit.ly/SYSS feedback. And again, that's the initials or the acronym for the webinar series, Supporting You, Supporting Students. So bit.ly/SYSS feedback, if you'd like to fill that out. And we're also going to have some Q&A time here at the end of our presentations. And so the panelists will be participating live. And so we'd love to get your questions. And a way to submit that is by visiting that third link, bit.ly/SYSS2020. So if you have a question, you can direct it who it's for, and our presenters and our team will see that and we'll be able to take a look at those, see some running themes, because we've had quite a few questions that have been asked, thousands of questions, I can say. I mean, the registrations as of this morning were over 8,000, like over 8,600 registrations from California and beyond, which is really evidence that this is important and this is valuable. This is crucial for us to be meeting together. So we're so glad you're here. And one of the best ways for the dozen people from behind the scenes to get all those questions for our Q&A time is going to be using that link, bit.ly/SYSS2020. And finally, the recordings of this will be available. That's going to be on our YouTube channel, just youtube.com/wellnesstogether, or you can go to our website, wellnesstogether.org/events, and you can find those on YouTube before this next week. So thanks again for being here. And again, my name is Jeremiah Aha, Assistant Director here with Wellness Together School Mental Health. Glad to be hosting you. And now I'm going to be turning it over to Marlon Morgan, our Executive Director. And he has some words of welcome for us, as well as a poll we can participate in this afternoon. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Jeremiah. And it's really great to see all of you engaging once more for the 3rd week in a row on this webinar. We're really hoping that the information we're able to bring you is valuable and helpful while you're continuing to serve your students via a distance modality. And we just hope that we find you healthy and safe during this time. So I want to take a moment to thank again some of our partners in putting all of this information together and making sure it gets to you in a timely fashion. That is our partners at the California Department of Education and Superintendent Tony Thurman, who joined us last week very grateful to him and the California Department of Education, also the California Office of the Surgeon General. Nadine Burke-Harris was able to join us the first week of our webinars, and so we're thankful to her for that. Also Blue Shield of California has been instrumental in a number of ways that we'll go into a little bit later for helping us deliver this information. The National Center for School Mental Health, we're so pleased to have them here today, and Stanford University and the Stanford Center for Youth and Mental Health and Wellbeing, the USC Suzanne Dvorak Peck School of Social Work, the California Association of School Counselors, the Pacific Southwest MHTC, and California Association of School Psychologists, along with the Children's Partnership and the San Joaquin Child Abuse Prevention Council. And again, especially you, thank you for being here. I did want to start today a little bit differently with a poll. We've been hearing a lot, a lot of good feedback from all of you saying that one tool that's been very helpful to see how you're doing, to see how your students are doing, is the 10 to 15 minute distance check-in. And so we wanted to do our best version of that with thousands of you here today. So we're going to do it a little bit differently, giving us a little bit of time to just check in with ourselves and get a little bit more insight into how we're doing. And then we'll also get to see, this is an anonymous poll, so we'll get to see at the end the results and just really normalize and validate and look at how we're all doing as a group. So gonna allow everyone to vote and launch the poll. You should see the poll on your screen. If you do not, then please click polling down on the bottom of your screen. And I'm gonna go ahead and read the questions while folks are voting. So want to make sure that people are able to access. If you're not able to access the questions, please, it does look like we are getting quite a few results in. So if you're not able to access the questions, just go ahead and listen to me as I read them, and we will take some time to consider. One, we just kind of wanted to know, is your district doing or planning to do some of these 10 to 15 minute brief check-ins with students to see how they're doing, kind of letting them know that we're out there thinking of them and wanting to see if they need to be connected with resources, things like that. So that's question one. Question two, how do you believe your students are coping with the social isolation that we're all kind of having to go through at this moment, to protect ourselves? Question number three is, how are you personally doing with your relationships? This is, being alone or having to isolate and then being in the home with family members and people you normally love, it can hold up a magnifying glass and also a mirror. I believe, if there were issues there before, what we're seeing is a lot of folks, those issues become more magnified because you're seeing each other every day in and day out. And then sometimes it holds up a mirror for us too. Things that we might have been ignoring in the past, or things about ourselves that maybe we had a little bit less insight on. It allows us to really consider some of the things that on how our behavior and affects other people as well. The fourth question is, how are you personally managing the stress of providing services to students and families during this crisis? Fifth, this is a true or false question, and you can be honest because this is anonymous, but I am using positive coping skills to manage stress during this time. And just so you know, it's not up to me or anyone else to decide whether or not ice cream or dessert is a positive coping skill. Some days it has to be, and so we understand that. And finally, this is one that I needed to check in with myself on. That's question number 6, is I'm participating in at least 30 minutes of physical activity several days a week. So we'll give you just another couple of minutes to put your answers in. We're getting a lot of responses in, and maybe just another few seconds, and then I will end the poll and share out the results. Okay, we're hoping to get your last answers in here, and we should see a pattern. And let's share results and let's take a look at them together. So it looks like your district, wow, and that would make sense. Looks like 92% of our districts that we're calling in from are participating or planning to participate in some form of those check-ins that we're talking about. That is excellent, it's wonderful. And it's great for you to know that if your district's not doing that, might be some information that's helpful for you to take that information back to your district and kind of say, hey, you know, maybe watch this webinar, because I think a lot of districts are helping students in this way. You know, it does look like most of us are somewhere in the middle with how we believe our students are doing and coping with the social isolation piece of this. So that's relatively okay. And it looks like for number 3, how are we personally doing? The good news is, I think the majority of us are doing fairly well. It would indicate here today, even getting information like this can be considered something that would be helpful, hopefully. And so relationships are doing well, and managing stress fairly well there too. But there's a number of us that are struggling, and I think it really depends on what day and what time of day. And if it's at the end of the day and you've been homeschooling all day at the same time you've been working, I think that answers might be a little bit different, but we're doing pretty good here in the middle of the day. And then also using positive coping skills, that's great, because again, checking in with ourselves, but also being able to model that and share that with our students on check-ins that we're using. These are some positive coping skills that I use. If you have 10 or 15 minutes with a student, it's great to be able to share that with them. And then finally, participating in that physical activity. Most of you have me beat, and it looks like almost half of us are doing that. So that's great. And we all know how important that is for our mental health as well as our physical health. So I really appreciate you taking the time to participate and just taking a brief moment. If we're going to spend all day checking in with students and having meetings with our colleagues, you know, what I've noticed is there's even less time for transition. We're not driving someplace, and so you go from meeting to meeting, and sometimes there's even less of a chance to check in with yourself. This is so important. So please be doing this. I'm so excited about all the information that we have today to hear from the folks that we have. I do want to introduce Kimberly Goode from Blue Shield of California. Blue Shield, again, has been instrumental in the Blue Sky Initiative, and also continues to work with Governor Newsom's office on efforts to scale up testing for COVID-19. Kimberly Goode is Senior Vice President of External Affairs at Blue Shield of California, serving over 4 million of us in California. Kimberly's active in the public relations profession and in the community. She's a member of the Arthur W. Page Society for Chief Communications Officers and the Executive Leadership Council, which is an organization dedicated to the development of global African American leaders. Kimberly has been a champion of diversity throughout her career and was selected as one of the most influential women in business by the San Francisco Business Times, and we welcome her here today. Kimberly, thanks so much for being with us here.
Well, thank you, Marlon. You missed the most important qualification, and that is that I'm a mom of 3. And so from the bottom of my heart, I sincerely want to thank everyone on this call for all that you are doing to help students and youth have mental health during this, strong mental health during this crisis. 2 of my children were unexpectedly shipped home from college due to COVID-19, and we are wrestling with a 4-generation household where we've got all the way from 18 to 94. So certainly I personally can relate to dynamics that we're all experiencing as we try to cope in this difficult time and try to create as much normality as possible for young people. So thank you for that. On behalf of our 6,800 employees and our more than 7,000 members, I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you, both Jeremiah and Marlon, for the invitation. Whether you're an educator, a counselor, a mental health professional, or an administrator, you are playing a critical role, and we appreciate what you do every day. None of us could have predicted we would have been in a situation like this, and how quickly everyone has adapted to both ensure safety and to try to drive continuity is certainly impressive. For us at Blue Shield of California, as we strive to serve our members and the community, particularly the most vulnerable, well-being absolutely matters to us for both adults and youth alike. Last fall, we introduced the Blue Shield of California Blue Sky program as a way of working with Wellness Together and other partners, along with the California Department of Education and many local school districts at a statewide initiative to really address the mental well-being and build resilience in young people. I'm sure many of us have seen the Children Now report card for youth in the state of California, and mental health certainly rose as an important need to be addressed. So through our Blue Sky program, we are able to bring Wellness Together school mental health clinicians into 19 schools, middle and high schools throughout Northern and Southern California. And that provides direct mental health services to students that are most in need. Now, since the shelter-in-place order has affected all of us, we've been so inspired by the work that so many people have done to adapt, to continue to show leadership, to continue to be resourceful, and to meet the needs to care for students. The online resources, the telemental health, and all the other ways that we're checking in with students and meeting them where they are is so important. And thank you, Marlon, for not judging me for my positive coping skills of ice cream, which I had last night. I know that you all know that but it bears repeating as adults, that despite the tragedy and the uncertainty that this time presents, we're going to get through this, and we need to help young people understand that too. All the care that you're providing to meet them where they are and be the supportive adults in their life is truly necessary and very appreciative. So thank you for what you're doing to help children, particularly those who have experienced adverse childhood experiences and may not have the support system at home that some of us do have. As a nonprofit health plan, Blue Shield is really committed to ensuring that all Californians have access to care both during the crisis and beyond. We did a number of things during the COVID-19 crisis to really ramp up our support to not only help our members ensure they have the care and that they need, but to help ailing providers and to make sure that the healthcare system is strong. And of course, we have made adjustments to ensure things like covering televisits for mental health professionals is available for youth and children alike. We're also continuing our commitment to efforts like this. We don't see this as a time, despite all of the economic uncertainty, to shift away from those priorities that we know will help drive wellness in our state. So in addition to continuing to support initiatives like this, we also have identified a number of additional investments to support community organizations who are addressing the most vulnerable impacted by COVID-19. Certainly, we also are concerned about the well-being of our own workforce. We worked very quickly to move all of our employees to work remote so that they would be able to continue seamless service to our members while also ensuring the safety for them and their families. We've provided additional leave for anyone that's impacted, and certainly have taken the time to check in with our workforce to make sure that they are also coping well during this time. One of the things we've started internally is an internal series called Silver Linings, and the purpose of that is for all of our employees to be able to go online and share some of the positive impacts that they've experienced during this difficult time. Whether it is spending more time with family or enjoying the outdoors and the fresher air that we all get to access now, we think it's important to keep that perspective that despite all the negative news, there are many positive things that we should also be grateful for. So as I think about silver linings, I think about, again, everyone that's on this call, the thousands of you who are so committed to continue building up your arsenal, to be able to not only take care of yourselves and your families personally, but to put yourself out there to help young people. So thank you for that. I want to, again, express our appreciation to the Wellness Together team, to the California Department of Education, and all of the partners on this call who made this webinar series so meaningful. You're doing what you're doing makes an absolute difference, and we can't thank you enough. So I'm going to stop talking and let you all dive into the content. I'll turn it back over, I believe, to Jeremiah. So thank you for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you as well, Kimberly. We certainly appreciate you being here and for the support that Blue Shield of California has offered. Monica had mentioned just last week the generous gift I'm giving to the California Department of Education in order to provide youth mental health first aid training across the state. And so this is really a way to equip educators, admin, support staff, all those, whether we need a review on some of the recognizing the signs of mental health challenges in our students or even in our colleagues. So thank you for that. It has been a joy to work with your team, and we look forward to years of that moving into the future. And speaking of Monica from the California Department of Education, have her back here again this week. If you want to know anything about Monica, I would say this: she is an absolute champion of student mental health. And so she had a few important things to share with us. So Monica, I'll turn it over to you to share what's happening there with the CDE.
Start. Unmute. Where's my video?
Okay, wait, yes. There you go.
All right. So sorry. Technical difficulties. You guys would all laugh at me because I'm sitting here with 3 different computers trying to see which one is going to have the best connection. So thank you for your patience for those few seconds. So good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the California Department of Education, I want to welcome you to today to join us here in this 3rd webinar of the series, and just really happy that you have carved out the time to be here with us today. We're grateful again, to our friends at Wellness Together and all the partners, which I won't name because they've been named before, but they're, critical partners. They've worked hard to bring this webinar series to you. And really the collaboration between the partners is a true demonstration of how we're leveraging strategic partners to be able to meet the needs of our students, as well as you, our staff, during these challenging times. I'd be remiss if I did not underscore that the health and safety of our staff and students is a top priority for Superintendent Thurman and everyone at the CDE. The CDE leadership and staff are working diligently, both internally and with external partners, to ensure that you are all receiving timely and relevant information that will help you ease the weight of working through this difficult crisis, right? We never expected that what we're experiencing right now with COVID-19 really is unlike anything that we've experienced in our lifetimes. And for many of us, life as we know it has been turned upside down. So the CDE fully recognizes the stress and the worry that this situation has brought on to you, your students, their families, your families. And with that, we understand and fully recognize that people respond to stressful situations in different ways. So it's important for everyone to care for themselves. I know we've said this over and over again, but it is critical that you care for yourselves, we care for ourselves, to be able to manage stress. This is difficult for everyone, but especially our young students who don't have enough life experiences to pull from, those life experiences that let everybody know that we've gone through tough times before and that we're going to get through this. We're learning a little bit more every day, and so that is helping to build our skills and to build our hope. The sheltering in place, without a doubt, not having our conventional social connections and practices can take a negative effect on our well-being. And so we saw, thanks for the poll, Marlon, even though we talk about resilience, we also see that there's 5% that are not doing well in isolation, and that 1% and 18%, you know, are kind of toggling with their personal relationships. So what we want to hear from you is, what can we do to help you? Please tell us by sending an email to wellness@cde.ca.gov, and that's wellness@cde.ca.gov. We know that we're already starting to see the tragic impacts of isolation through the increased suicides in both youth and adults. And we want to be there to help spread the word that you are not alone, students are not alone. And whatever we can do to help make those connections, please call on us. Many of us personally are struggling and experience our own traumatic situations while we're also trying to connect with our students, also who have multifaceted urgent needs, right? These urgent needs range from basic things like food and shelter, medications, and then also the lack of social interaction, which we all know is pivotal to survival, and sometimes the impact of that social interaction is underestimated. The lack of normal connectivity to school is leading students to start seeking help from each other. Now really would be a good time for us to take pause and determine how we can empower youth with accurate and helpful information so they can take care of themselves and support each other in a positive way with the best information out there possible. So friends, I tell you, this is the perfect opportunity for us to stop doing for our students, right? Even though that's, those of us who are parents, that's what we want to do. We want to do for our students. We want to do for our children. And what we need to do is really engage them in finding solutions to what the current issues are. We need to hear directly from them about their needs and let them know that we're interested in what they're saying. And secondly, what we hear from them is really going to help our drive our efforts strategically. We should embrace this opportunity. I know it's difficult, but you know, finding the silver lining and embracing this so we can renew our vision for student and staff wellness in California. This is truly a determining time, a time where we can flip that switch and make a significant difference in how we operate. So let's start first and foremost by engaging our youth. Why don't we take the time, you know, to really ask them directly about their needs? Let's ask them things like, what is stressing you out right now? What are you most concerned about? What can help alleviate your worries? And what do you want your teachers and your principals and other members of school staff to know about your situation right now? We cannot continue the same narrative of saying, how are you doing? I'm doing fine. Okay, great. Just wanted to check on you. We have to shift that paradigm to really figure out what's going on. And although we may think we know some of the answers to their needs or some of their questions, our efforts really should be led by what they are telling us, right? That's really important, hearing from them. And conversely, we need to hear directly from you on the front lines. You know, we want to know what your current concerns are. What's stressing you out right now? What do you need to alleviate your worries? And what do you want your administrators and your colleagues to know about your situation? Because when we talk about distant learning, you know, most of the time we're talking about the impact and the effect that it's having on the students. Well, what about our staff? You know, our staff sometimes they're not doing that well on a particular day. So we need to also address their needs. Our current dilemma really is a big one. It's trying to find a delicate balance between making sure that students are safe and healthy, and also ensuring that learning and academic exposure is still happening. In the same efficient manner that we ensured and we jumped up and, you know, met the students where they are to have access to free meals, we also have to ensure that students have access to mental health support. And remember, this doesn't always mean therapy sessions. It can mean simple check-ins and referrals. And this is a good time really to start engaging all staff members, right? We shouldn't overlook the opportunity for school leaders to restructure the roles of support staff during these closures. From what I understand, many school staff are still getting paid during this time. So let's put them to good use, right? By allowing them to check in on our students. There's a significant amount of students, although 92%, I was really impressed that 92% of the folks on here are checking in with their students. That's fantastic. But there's also a significant amount of students that we haven't heard from. And so let's change this, right? Almost, I'm not going to say every staff member, but almost every staff member can be equipped with the skills and prompts to check in on students, always having the parameters of, we're not therapists, we're just calling in to make sure you're okay, trying to find those red flags and those key words that if we see those, that we then can refer them on for services or have somebody else come in and check in on them. So this sometimes can pose some issues, right? But LEAs could be exploring drafting guidelines for reaching out to students. And the CDE is taking a leadership role on this, working on some sample guidance that will be released shortly. And so be on the lookout for that. So again, when we're talking about restructuring the roles of support staff, what does it look like? It can look like, allowing our school secretaries to check in on folks, or anybody that students have a relationship with, have those staff members go through the list of students to see who they recognize and who they have a connection with. And that way, the burden of checking in isn't just on a few folks at the school site. It also can mean that we're allowing our counselors to do more than class scheduling and school psychologists to do more testing, although they are very active and doing other things. This is going to help increase our school's capacity to make sure that the support staff are still there to help the students and to give them access to what they need. So recently, I can give an example. We've been working with the school district that has 16,000 students, and they were able to check in on all but 20 students, right? 20 students were unaccounted for. And there was one particular student that they had a real concern about. And they remembered, we can't get a hold of this, but they remembered she has a Chromebook. So they used the GPS tracker in her Chromebook, found where she was, went in, knocked on the door just to make sure that she was safe. They weren't there to collect the Chromebook. They weren't there to talk about academic instruction. They just wanted to be sure that she was safe. The other thing that, staff or leadership can do is, it can mean like surveying staff to determine any special skills or interests that they have. Maybe there's a school secretary who also, paints or sews. This maybe can lead to a virtual class that's not necessarily 100% aligned with the curriculum, but that can inspire students and help build those connections. So when it's time to go back to the brick and mortar school, they have solid relationships. Our job as educators is to meet the students where they are. And right now they're at home. So our thinking should be around what we can do to support them there. Our students need to continue to know that school staff is there, that they care about them, and they need to know above all that they are more than academics, they're more than a number, they care about their health, safety, and their survival. So let's use this time to build relationships. Our administrators and district leaders can reach out to local agencies with whom they can partner to build capacity on their campuses, using such organizations like Wellness Together, Mission Possible, and too many others to name. Partnering with outside agencies is going to help provide these services to students while we're out of school. And while we're on that, I just want to talk very briefly about a misconception in the educational sector, right? Folks are counting on building partnerships between schools and county behavioral health departments to increase Medi-Cal billing, to help fill the gaps in services and also in funding. And while this is a very important aspect, it's not the solution. It's part of the solution. And so that's something that we should continue to keep in the back of our minds, right? We have to make every effort to seek other strong alliances and partnerships. So there's a lot to do, but I want you really to remember that the CDE is here to support you as we journey through the COVID-19 crisis. Be sure to visit our website, to learn about the different webinars and activities. There's a town hall that the superintendent had. He was on CNN this morning, and so he's doing a lot really to support California. If you have any thoughts, any ideas or feedback, give that to us at wellness@cde.ca.gov. And a reminder, we have a student mental health policy work group that has been working together since 2012. We meet quarterly. Our next meeting is on May 22nd, and it's been held in person until now. We are going to be holding this virtually, and so we're going to have capacity to hold 100 participants, including the formal members. If you're not familiar with this group, what we do is examine what's happening in our state and also in the nation in terms of student mental health. And what we do is then make recommendations to the state superintendent of public instruction to improve how we serve students through mental health. I also want to remind you to visit our Help for Students Crisis webpage on the CDE website. And I want to acknowledge all of the hard work that you do each and every day while you're operating remotely. And thank you on behalf of the 6.2 million students that we serve together. In closing, our road ahead is not going to be easy. There's much to navigate, especially because our systems were not prepared, for this. There's a lot of change. And I'm hopeful that California schools are going to come stronger and more prepared to serve students through different platforms. Lastly, be gentle with yourself, please. Give yourself and others grace. We're all trying to navigate these situations and make taking care of yourself a priority. We need you. If you are struggling emotionally or you notice one of your colleagues, friends, or family struggling, please reach out. We are here to help. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us, and a big thank you to the presenters who are going to be sharing useful information with us today. Have a wonderful day.
Monica, thank you very much for the encouragement, for the resourcing, and for your heart, not only for students, but for supporting all of us here on the call today, and for those that are serving students. So again, that email address to reach out for support is wellness@cde.ca.gov. And as she said, CDE would like to hear from you. How can they best support you and equip you in the role that you have right now, as we're trying to still find our footing, maybe some of us still out there. I agree, it was encouraging to see that over 90% of the districts represented here today were participating in distance check-ins with students, but there's still, about 8% that weren't. I would recommend for those of you to visit the resource folder. There is Tom Sopp and Dr. Sue Coates from the California Association of School Psychologists. They have a great presentation in their folder from April 9th in part 1. And just a review or a real kind of a roadmap to do a check-in with the student in this new kind of environment. So again, bit.ly/supporting you, supporting students. That'll give you access to that resource folder. And if you need help or need a refresher, if your team needs a refresher for how to do check-ins, I think taking a look at Dr. Sue Coates and Tom Sopp's presentation from April 9th in there would be a great place to start. Feedback, it looks like there's been about 500 or 600 that have joined us late. No shame here, none at all. We're glad that you're here and you were taking care of a few things, no problem. I'm glad that you're able to make it. And also, as Kimberly said earlier, no shame in maybe enjoying some ice cream on a regular basis in order to get through some of these tough times. No shame here. Part 3 of supporting you, supporting students. So some helpful links, as I was saying, some feedback if you'd like to leave that, or share what would be more beneficial for you during these times, bit.ly/SYSS feedback. That SYSS is the acronym for the webinar series title, Supporting You, Supporting Students. If you have questions for panelists, as are about to introduce our first presenter, and they will be participating in a live Q&A. If you have questions for them, go to bit.ly/SYSS2020. And recordings of this will be available on our YouTube channel. You can subscribe, that's the fastest way. Once we uploaded the part 2, there when we had the welcome address with Superintendent Thurman with us last week. All those that were subscribers got that first. And, or you can go to our website, wellnesstogether.org/events, there for recordings of these videos. And one last announcement, it's actually very exciting. I'm pleased to announce before introducing our first presenter, Dr. Sharon Hoover. And that is, drum roll, that is actually, today is part 3 of 4. That's right, we're gonna have a bonus webinar. It's gonna happen next Thursday. And we're delighted to have Dr. Stephen Brock from Cal State University, Sacramento is going to be here. You likely have heard of Dr. Brock as he's the lead author of the School Crisis Prevention and Intervention, or the PREPARE model. And he'll be here for a full 1.5 hour long presentation on the PREPARE model here for us. Dr. Stephen Brock next week. If you're already registered for this webinar series, no need to do anything. You will be invited and given a link to participate with us same time, same day, Thursday, 1 o'clock. We're excited to have him. So surprise, you're invited next week. This is installment 3 of 4. Next week, Dr. Stephen Brock presenting on the PREPARE model and ways that you can support your students in the midst of a crisis that we're all doing right now. So I hope you can be a part of that. And at this time, I'll introduce our first presenter. We're delighted to have Dr. Sharon Hoover here with us. She is a licensed clinical psychologist and an associate professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and she's the co-director for the National Center for School Mental Health. She currently leads national efforts to support states, districts, and schools in the adoption of national performance standards of comprehensive school mental health systems. She's led and collaborated on multiple federal and state grants with a commitment to the study and implementation of quality children's mental health services. Currently, she's leading 2 large randomized trials of school mental health efforts. One's focused on reducing exclusionary discipline practices by installing mental health and restorative practice approaches. And the other is on improving school mental health services with best practices in family engagement, educator mental health literacy, and culturally responsive, modularized, evidence-based clinical practices. Creating safe, supportive, and resilient schools has been a major emphasis of Dr. Hoover's research, her education, and clinical work. And since 2004, she's worked with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the Treatment Services Adaptation Center for Resiliency, Hope, and Wellness in Schools, to train school district and school leaders, educators, and support staff, so that's all of you here today, and multi-tiered systems of support for psychological trauma. It's a privilege to have her. Dr. Hoover, thanks for making the commute all the way from the East Coast to be with us. I'll turn it over to you now.
Great, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Jeremiah. I'm gonna go ahead and attempt to share my screen. Let's see if I can do that. It looks like it's not allowing me to share, so I'll pause a moment and perhaps that can be organized and then I'll share. But thank you so much, Jeremiah, and to all of our partners at Wellness Together. I was really heartened to hear Marlon's introduction, and also from Kimberly and Monica, your words resonated. I have to say, Kimberly, also as a mother of 3, I certainly could relate to your introduction, and I'm at the moment trying to navigate 21 different teachers, as mine are all teenagers in middle and high school, and so it's an interesting process. But I have great compassion for the teachers who are navigating all of this in a whole new world. So I'll go ahead again and try to share my screen. It appears that I am still unable to. Let's see if there's something I can do here.
Dr. Hoover, I have the PDF of your slides here, and if you're okay with it, I can share my screen and you can just walk me through it. Is that okay?
That would be fine. I know we had tried it. Yeah, that's fine. If that's the easiest way, I'll go with whatever easiest for all of you.
Okay. Well, team, I know there's quite a few behind the scenes. Unless there's anything that we can do, I'll go ahead and share mine. And it looks like we have you as a co-host, so it should be working. Maybe it's just a Zoom glitch. Apologize for that.
We know we're all dealing with technology glitches on a daily basis. So we are nothing if we're not flexible and resilient. So this will just be one good example of that.
There we go. Okay, let me pull this up.
Aha, I see it.
All right, how's this?
That looks good to me. I think I can see it okay. I apologize for having to have you go through them all. If at any point I'm able to share, I will, but because I know I have several there, so it might move. I might have you moving kind of quickly here, so I apologize.
No problem.
Okay. So again, thank you so much for hosting me. I am delighted to be with all of you and was heartened to hear all of the good work that's happening to support your students across California and beyond. And I'm just really grateful to have a little bit of time with you this afternoon, along with some of our other co-presenters. So I want to start by just mentioning a couple of themes that I hope to bring to what I'll be sharing today. The first is compassion, and we already heard a bit from Monica about compassion and grace. And the quote you see here is from a recent webinar that I was on, and there were a couple of comments from participants that stood out to me to remind me of the importance of compassion and grace at this time. This was one school counselor whose main question was, how do we engage our education system to take a compassionate approach? And then the next slide, yeah, there we go. This was an educator who said, it's a pandemic, she exclaimed. Families are all doing the best job they can, and we as teachers want to support and not overstress. And this statement, I think, really reminded us that all families and all of us are doing the best that we can, and that we need to approach not only ourselves, but also each other with grace and compassion during this time. So the other theme that I wanted to mention is this theme of always and now. So one of our partners, Leora Wolf-Poussin, who I know was a presenter during your 3-part or now 4-part series and is a partner from CARS, has been speaking about this idea of always and now, really as a reminder that there are many things that we lose touch with during a crisis, but that we do want to remember that there are some core principles and practices that we want to hold on to even during this time of crisis, including some of the core work that we do in school mental health. And there are things that we want to and need to layer on right now during this very challenging and complex time. And so I want to just keep these themes of compassion and always and now as I speak today. So in the next slide, I just kind of review what I'm hoping to cover with you in the time that I have. I'm first going to share a little bit about our National Center and share some resources with you. The second area I want to focus on is what's happening in Tier 1. So kind of how are we promoting mental health of young people in schools? And I know you're already doing a lot of that in your daily work. So I'm going to talk about that both in terms of what are the core things we can hold on to that we're doing always, but also what are the things we need to think about at Tier 1 right now in this context. And then I'll close with some information about Tiers 2 and 3 and early identification, intervention, and crisis response. And within each, I hope to discuss some practices and policies, including those things that schools are doing and want to continue doing throughout this time. So first, I'll start with our National Center for School Mental Health Resources. So just a little bit about our National Center. We were established in 1995. You can scroll on down, Jeremiah. Thank you. With funding from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And you can see our mission here. You can find out more about what we do at schoolmentalhealth.org. And we're based at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. We also operate as a community partnered school mental health organization. So I started my work at the university as a psychologist in the schools in Baltimore City, where I spent a number of years. And we continue to provide multi-tiered services to schools throughout Maryland and most prominently in Baltimore City and Prince George's County, which are two of the areas most significantly impacted right now in Maryland by COVID. The work that we do on the next slide, we work from a multi-tiered system of supports framework, and you can see in blue here some of the topic areas that we spend our time in. And so if you check out some of the things that we develop, they kind of fall into some of these categories. So we have a lot of technical assistance around financing and sustainability. I heard Monica mention earlier this idea that we can't solely rely on community partnerships and kind of the reimbursement funding that comes from that. And I wholeheartedly agree. It's a part of the system, but it can't be all of it. And so we spend a lot of our time in each of these little pie pieces here. So that's a little bit about what we do and how, how we view things. So on the next slide, you'll see one of the first resources from our center that I want to share. And all of these should be uploaded into the folder that I know you'll have access to. If they're not there now, they'll be there throughout the day. So this first one, I recognize, first of all, that many of you may already have a quite well-established school mental health system, but some of you may be coming from systems where your school mental health system is not as well-resourced or the infrastructure isn't there. And this is a guidance document from the field that was developed in partnership with some of our federal partners from the U.S. Department of Education and SAMHSA and HRSA, among others, as well as with some of our national and state and local leaders. And what you'll find in this document that you can upload from our site is just kind of the core features of school mental health, as well as a lot of information about the public health approach and the value of school mental health, and then some opportunities and challenges that we have as a field. And one of the more helpful things, I think, are then we go into some depth on local spotlights, state spotlights, and some ideas about moving forward. So if you scroll on down, there's just a few images of some of the things that you'll find in this document. First of all, the core features. These are really the core features of a comprehensive school mental health system as we conceptualize it. So I won't go into all of these in depth right now, but we do really think of the work that we do as being built on the foundation of well-trained educators and specialized instructional support personnel. So when community partners do come in to support a school mental health system, we really are relying very much on what our school leaders, educators, student instructional support are already doing to support student mental health. On the next slide, you'll see that we operate, as I said, from a multi-tiered system of support. And one of the things that we go into some depth on in this document are the foundational elements of that multi-tiered system. So these are built on family, school, community partnerships and youth being part of that family system. And then also the tenet of professional development and support for a healthy workforce. And I'll touch on teacher well-being and school staff well-being in a few moments. The next figure just gives an example of the complementary roles and resources of community partners and school districts in comprehensive school mental health systems. There is not a one-size-fits-all model for this. This reflects one way that sometimes schools and community partners navigate or negotiate that relationship, but it really should be a seamless partnership in that community partners should be coming in and really augmenting what's already there rather than just being an add-on. And so that's part of what we talk about in this document. I hope it's helpful. The intention of the document was for it to be modifiable. A number of states have already taken it and taken the language out to serve as a foundation for the work that they're doing and to be somewhat of a state guide. So on the next slide is another resource that we've developed in partnership with the National Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network. And the National Coordinating Office is based right there at Stanford University. One of my co-presenters today, Dr. Steve Adelsheim, is one of the leads there. One of the things that SAMHSA charged this network with doing was to develop a curriculum, essentially, not a curriculum for the classroom, but rather a curriculum for school district leaders on how to both understand, but also assess and improve the core areas of school mental health. And so you can go online to the network and see this whole district curriculum, and many districts across the nation at this point are using this as a way to engage in strategic quality improvement. All of this work, as you'll see on the next slide, is built on the SHAPE system or on the national performance standards, rather, that are part of the SHAPE system. So the SHAPE system, if you're not familiar with it, is another one of our resources that's freely accessible. And it stands for the School Health Assessment and Performance Evaluation System. And even now in this time of crisis, a number of systems have reached out and said, we want to make sure that our school mental health systems are as strong as they can be. Where do we start? And so for many schools and districts and even individuals, they've been able to go in here, register, and take an assessment of kind of how they're doing with respect to the national performance standards. So if you go to the next slide, it just demonstrates kind of the process that you can walk through. So any of you can go and register on the shapesystem.com, and you'll be able to either register as an individual or as part of a school or district team, for example, or as a state team if you're a state leader. You can map your school mental health services and supports. You can assess your system quality, receive custom reports, and then take advantage of some of the other features. So one of the features that's been the most highly accessed is our trauma responsive schools implementation assessment. And this was something that was done in collaboration with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. It's essentially a free online assessment of trauma responsiveness of your school system. There's a school level assessment and a district level assessment. And I think in this time, many schools, many more than perhaps were before, are acknowledging that we may need to better be attending as a system to the trauma exposure that is coming with this pandemic. So on the next slide is another resource that we've been doing in collaboration with the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network. This was actually a resource that was put out very recently to provide an overview of some of the supports that are already in the field to support mental health literacy for educators. And what I mean by that is essentially the knowledge that educators are equipped with to support students and themselves in terms of mental health knowledge, understanding of mental health, stigma, help seeking. And so we did a scan to see what was out there, and then you can see the link here, and we'll put all the links up for you. This provides an overview. If you go to the next slide, you can see how the document essentially is comprised of a categorization of each of the resources that exist in the field. This is the key. On the next slide, we show you kind of how it's broken down. So this is for you to basically access kind of what's out there right now. But what SAMHSA charged the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network in partnership with our center with doing in this year is developing a free online course for all educators in the nation to be able to access. You can see on the next slide what the structure of that curriculum will look like, and it will be freely accessible. We anticipate this fall, and I can't imagine in some ways a more important time for our educators to be equipped with some of the tools, not only to promote mental health and well-being of all students, but also to understand and support students experiencing adversity and distress. And we're also working with one of the regional partners in the Central East at the Danya Institute to develop a whole series of modules on cultural responsiveness and equity as a complement to this mental health literacy resource. So look out for that. On the next slide, you'll see that now we're kind of moving to the now. So we talked about always and now. And as with many of us, we've had to pivot our work at the National Center to have a direct focus on the impact of COVID-19. So you can find many of the resources that we've compiled, many of which have been developed by others, some of our national partners in the field. And you can find our COVID-19 tab at schoolmentalhealth.org. And most of these resources I've uploaded into today's presentation. So we have been trying to get resources out to people while also trying to strike the balance of not flooding people with resources, because we recognize that everyone's just trying to keep balance in doing the work that you're doing on a daily basis. So we've collated them. We've tried to vet them for the best that we see that's out there. If you have a resource you think should be added, please let me know. So I want to move us now into kind of this second area, which is what's happening in terms of mental health promotion. And on the next slide, you'll see just some of the things that schools are doing in general before the pandemic hit to foster mental health and safe and supportive schools. And I'll go into a little bit of detail on each of these. So you can just move on down, Jeremiah, thank you. So the first area is really that many schools are reconsidering what their mission is. One of the questions you can ask yourself to do so is, if you could pick one quality or skill that all young people would possess by the time they graduate from high school, what would it be? This is a question that Roger Weisberg at the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning has asked of us many times. And when we ask school leaders this, I want you all to think about it for a moment. But when we ask school leaders, what we often hear is not reading or writing or arithmetic. We know those are important, but it usually falls on our social emotional competencies wheel, which is on the next slide, and many of you may be familiar with this. And the reason this is so important is because we want to emphasize that if schools do believe, and if our partners, our families, our young people, everyone we ask this question of believes that these are some of the most important skills for our young people to graduate with, we have to make it part of our core mission. And I know Monica spoke to this earlier as well. Academics are critical, and social emotional learning and mental health supports are critical. So in the next slide, you'll see just a very concrete example of how a district adjusted their mission to reflect this shift from a sole focus on academic success to success with respect to social emotional well-being and an inclusive environment that is nurturing for students as well. There are many resources, one of which is on the next slide, that can help you to foster school climate, positive school climate, and create safe and supportive learning environments. Our partners at the National Center for Safe and Supportive Learning Environments have a whole free online system for assessing school climate, but also a school climate resource package that many districts have found very useful. On the next slide, you'll see one of the other important areas that many schools have been focusing on. More recently, we've seen an uptick in the focus on this in schools across the nation. This is wellness for school staff, and this is a bit of an amusing view of kind of why we focus on wellness for school staff. Why is this so critical? We know that educators in the typical world, not right now, but typically have a classroom in front of them with a lot happening, more than most people could navigate. And what you may not see on this slide is that this teacher up in the right corner is, while she's trying to ignore disruptions, she's also simultaneously plotting her career change. And we know that this is a significant, real concern in the field in terms of teacher attrition and burnout. On the next slide, we have our classic, iconic look at the idea that you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself first. I would say this is true more than ever right now for our educators. On the next slide, we point out some of the good research that talks about the impact of stress on our teacher stress on our students. We know that when our teachers are stressed and burned out, just like us as parents, we often have more negative interactions with the young people we're serving, even our own children. We tend to be more sarcastic, aggressive, respond negatively to mistakes. And this shows up in the very physiology of the students that have been assessed in some of these studies. The one thing that I joke about on the next slide is that there are some great teacher well-being efforts out there. And I should note that I'm a big fan of yoga, but we've heard from a number of teachers, please don't tell me to just do more blank, whether it's yoga, self-care. We know that's a critical component. But on the next slide, there's a bit of a long quote that I think is really worth us all taking into account right now as we think about, well, teachers, need to be well during this time. It states, when we accept that an unhealthy level of stress is inherent to teaching and place the burden of stress reduction on the individual teacher, we limit our ability to improve overall school wellness. We can better shape healthy schools for teachers and students by addressing the underlying causes of chronic stress and cultivating environments that promote teacher wellness. And most of you would probably agree and could speak to this incredibly well. But we want to, as we're creating intervention systems and support systems for educators, to reflect this. So on the next slide, we have a bit of a comical picture again here of what many of us would like our work environments to look like. But more importantly, we want to be thinking about all the ways, all the kind of points of intervention to create teacher wellness. So on the next slide, another area that many schools always are attending to is this area of mental health literacy. And again, just this idea of building mental health literacy into the curriculum. This is one example, the Mental Health and High School Curriculum Guide. We know that some states are now requiring mental health literacy to be a part of the curriculum for students in a meaningful way, not just one day of a health class at one point in their high school curriculum. And so we'd encourage schools to continue thinking about this, again, perhaps now more than ever. On the next slide, you'll see that another area schools have been doing for a long time is this area of crisis response and crisis prevention and response. This is one model, psychological first aid, listen, protect, connect, model, and teach, that I know is a part of the series here. And I'm thrilled to hear that you'll be hearing about prepare in the next one of these. So in terms of some of the policy considerations, we've touched on those in the next slide. We don't want to lose sight of these in the context of crisis. We know that great funding shifts can happen and priorities can shift, but we want to make sure that we continue to support social emotional learning standards, mental health literacy for all, investments in school climate, social emotional learning, crisis preparedness, teacher well-being, and current funding streams. And then on the next slide, we start talking a bit more about what about now? We've already heard about daily check-ins. Some systems are doing this in a more formal way. Close Gap is one example of that I'll share on the next slide. But here we also have just a Google form that is a more informal way of checking. A number of our colleagues have done a good job of translating existing Tier 1 strategies like social emotional learning into the class. And our partners at Child Trends remind us that one of the best things our educators and school mental health professionals can do right now for young people is to encourage the 3 R's of reassurance, routines, and regulation. And so the link that you see here, and it's embedded in the slides that will be shared, speaks to each of those and how we can promote that during this time. On the next slide, you'll see one of the more kind of formal or sophisticated ways of assessing the daily check-in, kind of how are your students doing. Close Gap, it's a free online system for educators that a lot of folks have adopted at this point. But as I mentioned, it doesn't have to be too sophisticated. We can do it through the type of poll that you saw at the beginning of this, simple Google form, just verbal interactions with students. We have school counselors popping into distance learning and asking these things. So we do want to do check-ins. The next slide shares another resource that speaks to this idea of both supporting educators in terms of how we can regulate ourselves and do some self-care, but also some scripts and guidance to support students. It's one of the best resources that I've seen with very clear scripts for educators. This was developed by some of our partners in a district in Indiana, and it's within the folder that I've shared today. The next slide just reflects this idea of translating the practices from Tier 1 to support families. We know that families in many ways are our de facto mental health and education providers right now. This is some of our colleagues in Massachusetts. John Crocker from Methuen, Massachusetts, developed a wonderful slide series that I'll put in the folder as well, just on taking the core tenets of what we already do at Tier 1 and turning it into more of a coaching and consulting model to families during this time. The next slide just shares social emotional learning supports. Many online social emotional learning platforms are currently free to educators, including Paths, Rethink Ed. We do listen. Many of our school mental health clinicians are using it. Has lessons and books and videos on social emotional skills. And then we have seen some incredible creativity. If you search YouTube even, one of our favorites is the school psychologist, Adam Parker, who we don't know, but we discovered him because he's from Colorado, posted daily SEL stories and songs for children. And it's really inspiring just how creative our colleagues are. So the next area we want to touch on before passing it along is early identification and intervention, and also touch on crisis response. So this is kind of moving up our multi-tiered system of support. Some of the things that we know are happening in many schools always is this idea of well-being checkups in schools. And so our schools, sometimes in the context of a school-based health center, but sometimes in the context of the classroom, are receiving well-being checkups. It might look like a mental health screening, but it also might be something more along the lines of just doing a well-being checkup as part of a health assessment during the school day. Why is it important for us to be doing early identification and these types of checkups in the school context in addition to primary care? On the next slide, we illustrate that we know that the median age of onset of mental illness is early, with about half occurring by the mid-teens, about 3/4 by the mid-20s. We also know that later onset are mostly secondary conditions, and that severe disorders are often preceded by less severe disorders that go untreated. So we want to build the systems to do this type of early identification. We know this may be even more true as we return to school, and we're going to have, we anticipate an increase in certain concerns with students, whether it be anxiety, depression, suicidality, and post-traumatic stress. And so we want to do this. We also know that the school age years are a critical time for promoting the mental health of young people. I'm going to share the next slide, which just reminds us that we don't just go from identification to referral. We need to, and we'll hear from one of our other speakers about how to speak with educators about this, but they need to be equipped also with some concrete tips for starting a conversation with a student or a caregiver. You don't just say, I need to refer your child to a child psychiatrist, for example. So part of the mental health training for educators that we're doing that I mentioned earlier will have some of these very concrete examples with live demonstrations. Why is Tier 3 really important in schools? We also know that mental health treatment in schools is one of the best ways to ensure that young people get evidence-based treatment. Youth are 6 times more likely to actually complete mental health treatment when offered in schools versus community settings. There's some data here. I won't go into too much detail, but part of it, the reason it's quite relevant right now is this is some data after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, where they found that post-crisis, students who received mental health services in schools, trauma services specifically, were 6 times more likely to complete that than when it was offered in community mental health clinics. So it's really important that we invest in mental health treatment services in the school building. The good news on the next slide, we know that there are many evidence-based interventions that are being delivered in schools. One of those that's been adopted quite readily by a number of schools across the nation on the next slide is the cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools. The second edition was just released. And the reason I bring this up is not only because we've seen it adopted by so many, the completion rates are so high, but these are developed specifically for the school setting. On the next slide, there's a lot on it, but the main thing I want you to take away is that in a statewide implementation in Connecticut, in response to the shooting crisis that they had a number of years back, the students who engaged in Bounce Back, which is the younger version of CBITS essentially, and CBITS had a 90% completion rate. This compares to about 15% completion rate of mental health treatment in the community. So again, school mental health is critical. On the next slide, I just wanted to illustrate that there are a number of interventions that are developed specifically for the school setting and many that are adapted for schools. We've been working with our partners in Canada and the US on strong supporting transition resilience of newcomer groups, and it's school-based intervention. Again, just keep in mind a lot of interventions can feasibly be implemented in schools. And on the next slide, we are quite creative about expanding the capacity of schools to do this work, whether it's through telehealth or on the next slide, the creative use of hours beyond the school hours and beyond the school year. We have a lot of school providers that offer services outside of the school hours and school calendar. So again, with respect to policies at Tier 2, Tier 3, we want to keep at the forefront on the next slide this idea of considering how do we invest in well-being checkups to monitor students and ensure that they're okay and getting the supports they need. Many states offer state infrastructure grants. I know California has been exceptional about some of this work, looking to different funding streams, including Medicaid, Medi-Cal, private insurance coverage, and also state agency training and technical assistance. And we have a number of good examples. So I'll close with Tier 2 and 3 strategies that we want to think about now. So many of us were abruptly moved into a whole new way of doing mental health support for students at Tiers 2 and 3. Some of the lessons that we've learned just in the past few weeks are that as much as possible, we want to try to maintain some routines from in-person therapy you might have been offering, especially for students who'd already been receiving care. Consider how best to adapt structure, use web platform interactive features. Some of you may have found them, drawing with students, doing high fives over the camera, and then considering confidentiality and how to adapt consent. One of the first things that you need to think about on the next slide is just how do you establish those paths for connection, creating ways for all your students to reach out to you. We've seen some wonderfully creative ways of doing this. Support or counseling office hours are one of those ways. On the next slide, we encourage you to utilize telehealth. I think this goes without saying. We know many of you are. I was on a call this morning with all of our states' mental health coordinators, and a number of them said that they are just now gaining the capacity to do telehealth and still have grave concerns about equity in our rural settings and in some of our other settings where students don't have as much access. We know that federally HIPAA compliant platforms are temporarily not required to practice telehealth. We encourage you to establish confidentiality and maybe create a visual clue that the student can give you if they think that somebody else may be able to hear, or if they're feeling unsafe. A lot of folks are talking about the black dot on the hand as one way that students can tell you that they're unsafe via tele. We do have concerns about an increase in child abuse and a decrease in reporting. We encourage you to try to create a new virtual office space, even give a tour of where you are. And we know from the research in years past and now that some students and families actually prefer telehealth. There's a series of telehealth webinars that's been offered by the Mental Health Technology Transfer hosts. And I'd encourage you to check those out. We, on our next slide, we developed a Telehealth 101 webinar primarily for school mental health clinicians that goes into everything from how do you create and foster a collaborative and well-built rapport with your students via tele, but also how do you stage the screen, where do you put the camera, all of those basics. So you can check that out on our site. And then finally in Tier 2, Tier 3, we of course have to be thinking about crisis response plans. There are a number of good resources. They're all in the folder that I mentioned. In particular though, we want to be very aware of subgroups or students who may be at higher risk for additional adversity. We want to attend to some of the guidelines that already exist for risk of suicide. I know we'll hear more from my fellow presenters about addressing suicide right now. And also we need to equip our educators with signs of child abuse neglect, especially in telehealth. And then as we all do, I think at this point, I want to remind us all to give grace to ourselves and compassion to ourselves. We can't foster those around us and encourage flourishing, whether it's for our plants or our children or our students, unless we're nourishing and nurturing ourselves. So thank you so much. The final slide is just a way to get in touch with our center or with me. And I know we have an opportunity for questions. And so I'm going to, with that, close. And I know that we have a couple of great speakers next.
Dr. Hoover, thank you so much. I hope we made a good team. I feel like that was the case. I really appreciate you being here. Several of us here at Wellness Together specifically have been a part of the Advancing School Mental Health Conference, the national conference that's been happening for well over 3 decades. And just so appreciate your willingness to be here with us today to share all these great resources. Be a lot of good things in there. So thank you once again. And there were several questions that have already come through. Keep submitting those, attendees. And a few things just to head off right now that might be helpful. Number one, you can access these materials. So just give us up to a couple hours after the webinar, and those slides or PDFs or supplemental materials will be available in that resources folder. Or you can take a look at the chat box in your Zoom window right now, and that's at bit.ly/supporting supporting students. And that'll be accessible in perpetuity. So bit.ly/supporting supporting student. That's where the resources will be. And secondly, looks like since I made the Dr. Brock announcement for the surprise bonus episode next week, just to share with you, if you're already hearing this or if you're here live today, you're already registered for next week. So part 4, we're just going to add that to the series. So in the same way, if we have some people that have been here 2 or 3 times, welcome back, by the way, you'll already be registered for part 4 next Thursday for Dr. Brock. So there's no need to do anything. So if you only caught Prepare Model Dr. Brock presentation next Thursday, the crucial part, you don't have to do anything. You're already signed up. Your place is reserved for next week, Thursday, part 4 at 1 p.m. with Dr. Stephen Brock, one of the lead authors for the Prepare Model. So we hope you can join us next week. If you'd like to leave feedback, there's a link there as well, bit.ly/SYSS feedback. If you have questions, looks like several have already come through for both Monica and Sharon as our presenters already, or forgive me for Dr. Hoover. And just leave your questions at bit.ly/SYSS2020. And our recordings are available on our YouTube channel at just our Wellness Together, so youtube.com/Wellness Together. Being a subscriber is the quickest way to get those, or you can go to our website, wellnesstogether.org/events. So let's get to our next presenter. We're very privileged and excited to have him. This is Dr. Sust from Stanford University, and I'll give his introduction, and Dr. Sust, I'll turn it over to you. Dr. Sust received his bachelor's degree in psychology at George Washington University and worked as a psychiatric technician at Virginia State Psychiatric Hospital and completed an imaging genetics research fellowship at the National Institute of Mental Health. He received his MD at the University of Virginia, then completed adult psychiatry residency training at the University of Pennsylvania and child and adolescent psychiatry fellowship at Stanford University in the community track. After graduating, Dr. Sust worked in San Mateo and Santa Clara County government behavioral health settings, but has now transitioned to directly focus on his academic role as clinical assistant professor at Stanford's Psychiatry Department and Center for Youth Mental Health and Well-Being. Dr. Sust currently works to extend the accessibility of child and adolescent psychiatry through school mental health, behavioral health consultation in local primary care clinics serving the Medi-Cal population, and providing psychiatric consultation to tribal youth, working with Two Feathers Native American Services in Hoopa, California. Dr. Sust, thanks so much here for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jeremiah, for the very kind intro. I'm gonna cross my fingers on the share screen, and let's see here.
All right, looks like
success. Wow, computers work. It's great. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Steve Sust, and I am a child and adolescent psychiatrist at Stanford. And I've listed some of my community partners here that I'm not going to go over at this moment, but I just wanted to highlight that this presentation is targeted to those of you on the front line. Having been a lot at the tier 3 and beyond types of settings, I routinely wish that I'd had the chance to be more of a part of the tier 1 side of things, and getting the chance to talk with you all is a privilege in and of itself, because we get to compare notes about what I've observed and what I hope are some of the early signs that you might spot while you're out there in the community with your students. So to start things off, I just wanted to ground us with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. For those of you who already know about Abraham Maslow and all of his work, you'll realize that someone ruthlessly vandalized this copy of his hierarchy of needs. But I found this off of Reddit. I didn't actually create this. And I just wanted to use it as a way to anchor us, starting at the very top with self-actualization. That's the part of us that wants to activate and realize our superhero rock star sort of goal that we have for ourselves. But before we can get there, there are all these other number of things at the bottom that are also really important to have. Physiological bodily needs, air is going to come into your lungs, food and water is going to come into your mouth, you need to go use the bathroom. And if you've ever been in one of these situations where any one of these things is deprived from you, like not having enough sleep, it's very difficult to take a test or do anything critical when any of this stuff is missing. So very important to think about this, because it's one of those very obvious things to pay attention to that we sometimes cut corners on when we're running out of time in the course of our day. The next thing is having safe environments, safe people to be around, and just wanting to make sure that you have a trusted environment, a place to be at, and then also a trusted environment of people to be around. And that helps to gradually build up your self-confidence and starts to build up your courage in preparation for making that leap into rock stardom or superhero, whatever. This is actually my joke slide, and I've actually found this way before coronavirus, but the necessity of Wi-Fi and battery life is something that is obviously becoming a lot more apparent now, but it's just something to think about in the current times that Dr. Hoover has mentioned, whereby there are a lot of families that are trying to bridge the educational gap right now. And all of these necessities, including Wi-Fi and battery life, are important things to consider when thinking about our young people. In this next slide, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the difficulty of being able to really catch things. And this is off of the crisis text line. I've embedded the links in the lower right-hand corner of these slides, but they actually run a blog and they actually have a page where you can look through some of the data that they have. And I think one of the things that this highlights is that there's no one word that necessarily like signals that this is going to be a problem. As with all things communication related, words are words, but you need to have the context of things and you need to understand a lot of the other stuff beyond just the words that are coming out. But either way, it's still an interesting site to go look at because it allows you to have a finger on the pulse of what's going on and what people are seeing in your area at the safety networks. And while doing research for this slideshow, I got to reading a little bit more, and this is an article from the Washington Post that I've also linked to in the slides. And obviously, that's a massive transition for families and schools as we try to help educate our young people from a distance. And during the course of reading about this, a lot of the writers were talking with families and talking about what's called the summer slide, which is apparently a little bit of a performance change that happens when we reach the summer and there's not the same level of structure in their lives. Similarly, there's this word that was coined as I was reading about this called the Corona slide, that there's some changes in a youth's environment that's less structured and that there's the potential for some educational transitions that they're going to have to navigate together. And that's just on the student side. For a teacher who's managing at times 20 to 30, depending on the class size, it can be very, very stressful. But just so to say that we're in a very different time and a lot of the things that you were doing before is complicated that much more as we transition into online learning. In a typical sense, there are smoldering signs to watch out for when you're able to see the student face-to-face in a classroom. Marlon and Jeremiah had talked before about the 5 S's, and I'm just going to briefly cover some of them as signs that there could be something going on. Sleep and food and hydration, the things that were part of Maslow's hierarchy, extremely important. And when a child seems to continually be having trouble with these basic physiologic needs, it's definitely worth paying attention to that and acting on it or asking them about it to try to figure out if everything is okay. Grooming is another thing that is something to worry about for someone who's depressed and very stressed out. Conversely, on the other side of things, we've been worrying a lot more about commercial exploitation of our children. And for some who are very heavily groomed. I remember one case of a young person who came to my clinic, and admittedly, I have a really outdated iPhone 5 type phone, but they had an iPhone 10, and I was working in a county government setting with Medi-Cal families, and so it was very unclear to me what was going on at that moment, and it was something that got me to perk up and pay attention to that. So it's just something to think about. Not that it's wrong to have a better phone than your doctor, but just something to pay attention to. So school performance, obviously, when you're suffering from a mental illness, there can be a lot of performance changes that come as a result. One of the things I also ask teachers to pay attention to is when students are submitting content like homework, and there's any sort of bizarre or terrifying sort of experiences depicted, and there's some question about reality detachment and not necessarily being as grounded. I think that's worth paying attention to and just making sure that this isn't potentially the beginning of some kind of psychosis process, which typically comes up as young adults are nearing the transition towards the end of high school. The other thing to pay attention to is any content that depicts some of the helplessness and the hopelessness and is a worrisome sign in a lot of ways because a lot of the young people might not feel great all the time, but if there's any sense of loss of agency or loss of hope, that's a worrisome sort of place to be. One of the other things that's part of the 5S's is social isolation. Again, not interacting with people as much, or maybe even skipping class and not even handing in assignments. Definitely things to start watching out for. Another S, screen time. One of the things I wanted to highlight was work from a researcher at San Diego State, Jean Schwengi. She wrote a book about a lot of her research on large data sets of young people and their screen time. And I wanted to take a moment to highlight one of the papers that she wrote. And again, I've linked to that article if you'd like to read it in its entirety. But I wanted to call attention to this one diagram, which on the x-axis has the total screen use per day depicted in hours. And then there's the y-axis, which has participants with a lifetime diagnosis of depression or anxiety. She admits that her data has modest effect sizes, but I think in one of my talks, in one of her talks where I attended it, she was definitely saying that there was something happening around beyond the 2 to 3 hour threshold of screen time, and is worth thinking about in terms of paying attention to the 5S's, screen time, and how much of it that our young people are getting. More smoldering signs. There's a fairly simplified way of how I conceptualize anger, that it either goes outwards and you see it in the way of being argumentative, maybe even being combative and violent. And then there's anger as it turns inwards, where you have a lot of guilt and you have a lot of shame and you have a lot of self-confidence problems. And it's particularly problematic because in its extreme, you'll have self-injurious behavior and, suicidal thoughts. And it's, again, something particularly important to watch out for because there are some risks that are associated with it. And if catching it early, it prevents a lot of people from having to go through a lot of the safety net systems that are out there. The final S that I wanted to highlight was self-medication with substances. With the legalization of marijuana and a lot of the vaping that's happening in our youth, there's a little bit more attention that should be paid to those who are self-medicating and potentially even coming to school intoxicated. And then finally, with energy level, there's restlessness and impulsivity, and then there's just general difficulty focusing. Wondering if there's either an ADHD problem or if there's something either anxiety or depression related that's interfering with that ability to pay attention. This was a really interesting dissertation that I got to reading several nights ago. It's a pithy 100 pages of text to read through, but I loved that this student who submitted a dissertation on this topic of 12 young college-aged women who are suffering with depression and going through online learning. And in the study, in interviewing them, this researcher, Tracy Orr, highlights some of the problems they were running into with depression during their online curriculum. And some of that I wanted to highlight was the difficulty concentrating and the difficulty of depression interfering with them to organize their thoughts coherently, that the fatigue combined with the concentration problems made them utilize the extension option for a lot of their assignments a lot of the times. And that there is a lot of complaint about the social isolation aspect, and that they really appreciated any opportunities to be able to interact with peers, and particularly having peers who understood some of the struggles of being in an online learning environment. The final thing that really jumped out at me about this study was that they had a sense of like being overloaded, and that they were juggling multiple roles, being having a day job where they had to earn income, and then also coming home, maybe having to take care of a family, and then having to do what was called the third shift, which was their online learning. So this all probably sounds familiar, but this is something that I know we've implicitly understood, but necessarily haven't had the chance to talk about and study. The recommendations from the study were interesting in that the students actually wanted to have clear and concise directions and lessons, that they didn't want to have to click through too many things. They didn't want there to be too many obstacles, and just wanted things to be as simple as possible. What they also really appreciated was the general flexibility and compassion that professors had, and that there was allowance for extensions. One of the things that, again, makes it difficult sometimes to really be able to stick around in class and to be able to focus at all times for sustained periods is if there's a mental illness that's interfering with the ability to focus. And then there is also obviously, the social interactions that they were hoping for. So these are all just things for people on the front lines to consider in the transition towards online learning. And then Dr. Hoover and others before me have obviously covered the check-in process a lot. So please do look at their slides. I think that's really important when you do speak with them, because by the time the student gets to me, there are multiple missed opportunities to engage with them. And having a good check-in process is going to be particularly important. So I wanted to talk about a few cases where someone like myself might be more helpful. And the first scenario is somebody who's distracted and hyperactive. You've tried to make some accommodations, but they're not necessarily responding to that. There could be ADHD, there could be trauma, and there's a very clear case that medications could potentially help with that sort of situation. Another one is someone who's very depressed, and then they disappear from class for however many weeks, and then they suddenly come back in your class, and there's just like no expression in their face. They just look tired, and they're not groomed as much. Certainly a concern, and there should be some early alarms in terms of, does this person have major depressive disorder and what's going on there? And then the third scenario is a student who clearly has some anxiety and panic problems, and they don't necessarily always hyperventilate and run out of the classroom. But again, if there's ongoing recurrence of some of these signs and symptoms, it's worth considering whether or not to bring up this topic with your colleagues and your school-based mental health team in particular, if you have one. Making any sort of referral for any sort of service is not something that any one person alone should do. I think my hope is that teachers know of teams on their school site that can help to promote and facilitate these kinds of decisions and conversations together as a team. So again, we've covered the MTSS system multiple times over, but I wanted to use this as a reminder to make sure that you start having these conversations with your school mental health team in terms of knowing when and how to do things at your local site. One of the defining moments of any doctor's training program is when you run what's called a code. And that's when somebody's heart stops, and then basically the whole team has to come together and do a series of steps in workflow in order to restart the heart. And as you can see, there are multiple positions and there are multiple things to do. But for me as a doctor, one of the defining moments of each of our training is being able to remember back to the first one that we did and what a train wreck it was, because sometimes when you're in the simulation room, you might all be really smart with you and your classmates in med school, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily coordinated and that you've rehearsed and practiced enough to the point where you can actually run a code and realize the potential and power of what you're able to do and achieve together when you're well coordinated, rather than just by yourself and disorganized. So very important to, again, assemble as a team and have a very clear understanding of everybody's roles and what everybody's doing, and having a unified vision of how things are going to go forward.
Real quick to interrupt, Dr. Stust, just giving you the 2-minute warning here. Sorry.
Got it. Moving on. I'm not going to cover too much of the school-based mental health team structure, primarily because Dr. Hoover and Dr. Adelsheim will cover a lot more of it. I did want to highlight this picture of the MTSS from Colorado. I like that they emphasize the information sharing and the communication loop. I also appreciate that they're talking about making sure that there's good communication with the community-based providers, people like myself. The final thing I wanted all teams to have a very close understanding of are what local resources are available. I would expect that a lot of people here already know the value of trusted adults in a young person's life and being able to identify as many of them as possible. One particular resource I wanted to highlight that hasn't necessarily been mentioned as much in a lot of talks that I've been to is the presence of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and that each county has a chapter of their own, and that they have what's called a warm line number, and the person there actually has a very comprehensive list of the resources available in each county. And it's something that I think is underutilized and is an ideal place to go to get an idea of what resources are available. And then finally, if it comes to the point where you're having to interact with the police, you want to try to get a crisis intervention trained officer who's been specially trained for crisis situations and has gone through a certification process. In the interest of time and trying to get towards the Q&A, I'm going to end right here and thank everybody for their attention. Particular shout out to my team at the Center for Youth Mental Health and Wellbeing. This is us, kind of like a little Brady Bunch kind of picture. So thank you very much. Let's see, exit. Oh, wait, I gotta stop sharing. Okay, back to you, Jeremiah.
There we go. Dr. Suss, thank you very much. Certainly appreciate it. A lot of great resources there. I want to just keep moving to make sure that we are all wrapped up by 3 p.m. so that we can get to some questions. Many have been coming through. Thank you so much for submitting those, attendees. Let me share my screen and I'll introduce our final presenter for the afternoon. And that is Dr. Stephen Adelsheim. He's the director for the Stanford Psychiatry Center for Youth Mental Health and Wellbeing. He's a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist who works to support community behavioral health partnerships from local to international networks. Dr. Adelsheim has partnered in developing statewide and national mental health policy and systems, including those focused on school mental health, telebehavioral health, Native American behavioral health, and suicide prevention. And for many years, Dr. Adelsheim has been developing and implementing early detection and intervention programs for young people in school-based and primary care settings, including programs for depression, anxiety, and psychosis. He currently leads the effort to bring integrated and youth mental health programs to the US and is working with collaborators in Santa Clara County and the state to start the first sites in California known as Alcove. We're privileged to have you here with us, Dr. Adelsheim. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, sir. It's great to be here with everybody. I'm gonna share my screen and move to my presentation.
Looks like we're good. Success.
That is so great. Let me move this up out of the way, get to our slideshow. Okay. I'm going to be really efficient here. And let me just say how wonderful it is to be with everybody this afternoon, and thank you for sticking with us. This is the point where I would, if we were all together in one room, say it's probably time to stand up and stretch a little bit, but we're in, you're in the home stretch, and thank you for sticking with us to this point in time. What I want to do is, first of all, tell you I'm with the Center for Youth Mental Health and Wellbeing, as is Dr. Sust, and we've been working on a number of different issues related to school mental health support, as well as the Alcove programs, which I'll briefly mention. We've been doing quite a bit of work related to suicide prevention as it relates to media, and as Jeremiah mentioned, early psychosis related support as well. I want to just quickly thank Marlon, Jeremiah, and Monica for including Dr. Sust and I, and thanks Sharon as well for being willing to share all of her experience and her center's work with all of us in California. Some of the center team members that work to support us today are Vicki Harrison, Ana Lilia Soto, who works with our youth advisors, and Ivan, who helped pull all of this together. And I want to thank the Alcove Santa Clara County folks who are leading this national effort for these programs. And as I speak a little bit about suicide prevention issues, I want to thank the people that have been my educators and supporters here in California, Shashank Joshi, Vic and Mary Ojakian, Stan, Virgil Moorhead and Blair Kreutzer from Two Feathers, Elena Kadvany, who's been a wonderful journalist in this area, and the folks at Project Safety Net. You know, Sharon has already covered some of this information I was going to touch base with you about, but just a reminder of how early mental health conditions start for our young people, and the fact that if half of them are starting by the age of 14, where are the supports that we really need to have to be able to help young people stay on track and successful in school and then later on in life. The next slide over here that you see is from our colleague Pat McGorry in Australia, just highlighting the fact again that most mental health conditions you know, are happening between the ages of 10 and 30, and that is the primary health issue that young people have at all. You know, if they have any health conditions, they're mostly mental health related. A reminder that as we, you know, now are facing this difficult time with COVID, a reminder that, you know, we've had young people with depression and other mental health issues that we've not done a great job of supporting before. And now what we're facing is an even bigger challenge. And so, you know, I think we need to have appropriate expectations, but also realize there are many, many young people that still need our support. I worked for many years in New Mexico, 28 before coming to California, and worked there doing school mental health for many years. Like Dr. Suss said, I was one of those community partners, and I was involved in a model that was really focused on community partnerships in schools, in school-based health centers. And that became our way of reaching young people in school settings for support, both mental health, but then also primary care. And see that as a model that we should still be thinking about more in California. On the right, you see the Project ECHO program, which has been now an international model of linking providers and networks around different diagnostic issues. One of the things we were involved with in New Mexico that I know many of us are thinking about here is how do we create these multi-site connections via video where we're not only thinking about telehealth with an individual young person and family, but how do we build a network of our school health and mental health professionals to be able to have the support they need and the backup to be able to reach and support young people really across the state, as was an important model where I came from. We're focusing as a center on really creating a public mental health continuum for young people, really beginning with school health and school mental health, moving to these integrated models, and then also are very involved in those early psychosis efforts too. And within that framework, I just want to quickly mention the Alcove program, which are these integrated youth mental health programs that provide early mental health support, primary care, and other types of support as well. Really trying to create a space driven by and for young people to come in a community for early care. These are the components that we're working on building out. And now with the changes that we're seeing, you know, as we're looking at partnering with the state and with others to build out these models, you know, part of the question becomes how do we build out the support more directly, potentially through other means because of the virtual nature of care. So we're working on that as well and with other partners internationally and looking at models to do that. You know, Monica spoke about how do we ask our young people what they see as their needs. And as we were looking at developing Alcove and as we continue to talk to young people right now from our youth advisory group, we've been asking our young people. So I wanted to just share with you some of the insights that came from all COVID, and then I'll quickly share some that are coming out in the context of this period of time. But part of it is this sense from our young people that, you know, it's there's a lot going on. We're trying to balance many things as young people, but then also it becomes really hard to then ask for help in a way that, you know, that takes on the, you know, the value or use of a school mental health professional or someone else or a professional in the community. And even within the context of doing that, the stigma issues continue to be huge. And within that also, within our own families, there are often cultural struggles around what it means to acknowledge a mental health issue, look to be able to go out and access care as well. So there are lots of challenges for young people. And there's also this sense that, you know, people have great ideas for what we should be doing with ourselves, but it's not always clear that young people feel listened to. So to Monica's point, one of the things that we did with our youth advisors for our ALCO sites was really ask them how things have been going as they've been sheltering in place and trying to deal with whether they are young people who are not having prom or not having graduation, or young people who are starting to worry about what college is going to look like, whether they're going, planning to go, or applying, or community college, or how's the job market going to look when they finish high school or finish college. So some key points I think that we just wanted to share from what our young people are teaching us. You know, one is that as much as we're trying to find ways of support, and I think it speaks to sort of Sharon's yoga slide, you know, there are lots of people with lots of great suggestions about how we manage this time. But for our young people, there's a sense of really still needing the space to acknowledge their losses and to grieve those losses. And that as much as we want to provide key support and think about structure and how to handle your time and how to reach out to others, we need space for our young people to listen, for us to listen to them, and to be able to hear and acknowledge and help them grieve the losses that they're really feeling at this point in time. In addition, you know, they're getting lots of self-care tips, as we all are, and need to be thoughtful about how they're taking those in as well. In addition, I think for our young people, there's some guilt around how can they feel bad about a prom when there are people dying around our country, and, you know, how can they really have the space, or how can it be fair for them to feel sad? And we need to allow them the space to sort of have those feelings. And what we then saw with our young people was then their interest in reaching out to others as well. So I'll just quickly share with you some of the comments that they really made. What they learned was that we want to feel like we're actually being listened to before telling us what to do. Again, validating that loss. And I think for many of our young people, you know, they've lost the informal communications, just like we all have. Seeing people in the hallway and checking on them and saying hello. Being able to have those informal communications, and now they need to be much more intentional in our actions and our communications, is challenging for all of us at this point in time. The kind of support our young people are saying they really want is to keep checking on us. Check in with me, check in on me, so that it's not only sort of from a peer support and partnership acknowledgement, but keep checking. And when you continue to check on me, I know that you care. And so the importance of that, we can't overstate in terms of that need to feel like, maybe I don't want to talk with you today, but I hope you'll try again tomorrow because I really might need you tomorrow. So it's very important that we be consistent to maintain those relationships with our young people, with their families. And we're trying to help our young people feel comfortable with reaching out in a formal way, because that's really quite a change for them. At the same time, the technology fatigue issues are big as well. As we're looking at the social isolation issue, I want to quickly pivot to talk a little bit about some of the higher risk issues that we're seeing. As Monica mentioned, there have been some communities that have continued to face youth suicide issues at a time when it's not easy to be able to check in and provide support. So some of the things that we want to really do is be able to find ways to not only do that check-in, but think about ways to build access, whether it's telemental health support or looking at ways of linking young people to resources. We know that suicide is an increasing risk all over the country. I'll just quickly share that, what we're also seeing nationally, as much as the rates of young people 10 to 14 dying by suicide are lower than any other age group, they're really continuing to increase in pretty dramatic terms at this point in time. And this is data that was just released this month, that we're starting to see increases for 10 to 14-year-olds in terms of risk. And then particularly I want to highlight rural counties and the really higher suicide rates in rural parts of America, and the need to really ensure that we're looking at rural partnerships. For many of our rural communities, there's less access to mental health support. The mental health supporters, as you know, who are out there, are often wearing multiple hats, and it becomes very difficult to figure out how to support everyone with scarce and inadequate resources, which makes the telemental health issues become that much more relevant. I'm watching the clock go by here, and I want to just quickly say, and this is a slide from my colleague, Dr. Joshi, really that is when we're looking at suicide prevention, there are multiple places to impact and build support, and some of them are the educational components and other areas. One of the things seems important to also mention is what our young people are watching right now when they are sitting at home for many more hours has a huge impact. I don't know how many of you were aware that, for example, 13 Reasons Why Season 1, actually led to an increasing number of young people dying by suicide in the months after the show premiered. And so, thinking about the media issues of our young people are critical as well. As I mentioned, we work closely in Palo Alto around this issue because we're well known for having several youth suicide clusters. Project Safety Net has been a key group in terms of addressing that issue. And I highlight here, and is in the resource kit, the Hurt Alliance Toolkit, which is a wonderful suicide prevention and postvention tool for addressing these issues. The CDC came to Santa Clara County. There were a long list of recommendations to address suicide issues. And I think the reason that all of them are squeezed in on this one slide is to show that the solutions are really multifactorial, and that we really need to be looking at not just the schools, but the whole community's response in terms of support. And you see that in terms of this framework with Project Safety Net. I want to close just quickly. If you're doing telemental health related assessments around suicide risk, and I'm really glad Dr. Brock will have more time next week to go into prepare and some of the crisis intervention things. If you're checking with someone via televideo, there's some key points really as it relates to suicide risk. Knowing the backup numbers, knowing where to find that individual should it become emergent, how to find other family members, having the local backup number for the community, the crisis response team, Steve mentioned the sheriff, police, as well as just 911, because there might be in more rural or other communities the need for local crisis response. There's some good safety planning documents in the resource tool as well to help young people think through a structure to be safe and have support. And then one other thought is just, just like in a school setting, if you're doing a video connection with someone and you're worried about their risk, really working hard to maintain visual contact with them while you're awaiting that emergency service becomes a critical and important piece. I want to just quickly mention if there's a postvention situation and unfortunately there's a loss, the toolkit is helpful. And Monica, who spoke earlier, is our key contact person, and her email is there for the statewide crisis response team to help a school district prepare or respond if there's such a crisis. We've discussed who might be the at-risk vulnerable students, and you know who they are to be sure you check on. I was quickly going to talk about sort of media issues, and I think basically in closing, just want to say the one critical piece of this process that we don't often want to take on responsibility for is the media aspects of addressing a situation when there is a suicide. And we've seen several in the last few weeks in our state where the media was writing articles and really not meeting the guidelines. And the problem with that is the risk of contagion. And so it's very important for the school to take on the added responsibility of the communication with the media, having a media plan, a single point of contact, talking points that go out there, because the media response and using appropriate language really can have a big impact on decreasing future suicide risk within a community. Our young people have gotten involved in this issue and have made it a key factor that many of them are involved in our Palo Alto community to follow up with media when they don't handle these situations well. The closing thoughts I just wanted to really share, I think have already pretty much been stated. I think the one point I would just want to say is that, you know, this is a really hard time for all of us right now, and we're all grieving. And I think it's hard for us to acknowledge the lack of control that we all actually feel over so many aspects of our lives, and we're good at helping our students do it. We're not so great at doing it for ourselves. And also acknowledging that we have really good days and really bad days, and our bad days may be much longer and consecutive than our good days, and giving ourselves space to also not feel that we are as able to be successful and as out there and as driven and able to do our work as well as other people, and acknowledge just how hard this is for all of us becomes really important. And it just feels important to share that. I know I'm feeling it a lot of the time, and I'm assuming other people are too, but we need to give ourselves permission for that. So with that, here's our team, similar picture to Steve's. The resources that are here are listed, and I am done. Thank you very much. Here we go.
Dr. Adelstein, thank you very much on that, being gentle with others. Just having what looks like a Monet behind you was very calming. And
Oh, yeah.
Very good. Thank you for the resources. Those are important reminders for us. And, you know, there has been, as we've discussed, you know, an uptick in some of the deaths by suicide even in the past couple of months, which is very unfortunate. But I feel like a lot of these tools are here to help us recognize the signs, and really appreciative of you and your colleague, Dr. Suss, to help those students that maybe some things beyond our scope as school support staff or educators, we can really connect with the community or connect with others to be able to best provide support, especially in times when students are unsafe by themselves. So thank you once again. And I'm just gonna get to some of these questions. Thank you all for staying with us. And I will share my screen here. And if you would like to submit a question, we're gonna go for about 15 minutes or so over. I hope you can make that still a part of your day. There's still quite a few of us here attending, so thank you so much. So resources are there in that folder. You can check that out. There's a bit.ly for it. Provide feedback on that second link. You can ask one of the panelists today a question. Our team is going through those, and panelists are cycling through those. And the first one's actually gonna be for Dr. Hoover. So I'll just kind of give you a heads up before you turn your camera on. And finally, a recording of this will be available on our YouTube channel and on our website. Subscribers, I will say, are the first to get those videos. So feel free to subscribe. We can get those to you. And if you joined us a little halfway, if you missed this, something we're very excited to announce, there's going to be a bonus episode. It's going to be part 4 of a part 3 or 3-part series. But next week, Thursday at 1 o'clock, Dr. Stephen Brock from CSU Sacramento, one of the main authors of the Prepare training, is going to be here, and it'll be him really guiding us on how to best prepare for crises in the midst of a crisis that we're all kind of managing and navigating right now. So if you're already registered for this and you're seeing this in real time, you have to do nothing. Your seat is reserved for next week, 1 o'clock Thursday, April 30th, and that's going to be episode 4 or part 4 of this webinar series, supporting you, supporting students, and just real grateful partners with California Department of Education to host these for you. So the first question I have for our Q&A time is going to be for Dr. Hoover. This question comes in, and I thought it was a great one. You can really help shed some light on this, as you not only have local and regional context, but also across the country. And the question is, how can schools best help community partners during this time as we work together to help vulnerable students?
That's a great question. I agree, Jeremiah. And I'll try to be brief because I know our time is limited, but The first point is that schools shouldn't have to be doing this alone in terms of thinking about the mental health of our young people. One of the things we know nationally is that the rates of mental health services in a lot of our outpatient settings has gone down, not surprisingly, related to access issues and unfamiliarity with telehealth, and a lot of organizations also having a significant economic burden, many of our outpatient provider shops having to essentially shut down. So we're seeing a lot of transformation in our community mental health system. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of our community providers trying to figure out how they can reach the young people that they are available to serve. And so some of the creative ways we've seen schools partner around this. For example, we know schools in many ways are a communication conduit right now, the communication conduit to families. And so community providers have, for example, put brief blurbs or links within administrators' outreach to families in the daily or weekly updates that go out saying, here's our crisis response contact information. We've also seen partnerships between community providers and some of our student instructional support personnel, so our school counselors, for example, and a community mental health provider in the context of the in-person, distance in-person, so physically distance in-person contacts that are available in some communities. I know in our community, for example, for meal pickup, we always have a community mental health and a school mental health professional available there on site. In some of those on-site locations, our community providers have also just provided a pamphlet or flyer that can be handed out with meal distribution. So a lot of creative ways, but as a reminder, and this question is a great one to remind us that schools can be reaching out to the community mental health providers. Many of them are available and accessible via telehealth right now.
Excellent, Dr. Hoover, thank you for that. And I'll answer one. Just pay attention to, I want to put your attention to the chat box. And there was a question about, can we get some more of the updates from the CDE, particularly around COVID-19 crisis response? And there's a link in there in the chat box for you. Another question that came through is, I can tell you there is still room to register some of your colleagues, some of your team for part 4 of the webinar next week. We never had in mind that we would come close to the Zoom limit for webinars, which is 10,000, but there is still some room. Space is limited, but please send them to our website, wellnesstogether.org/events, and they can register there for part 4 next week. We look forward to having you. This next question is actually going to be for Dr. Adelsheim. Again, thank you for those resources. And this was a great question that I think you and Dr. Suss could speak to. Maybe you can lead out. And the question from one of our attendees was, what lessons from other ongoing periods of grief can we take and use for this ongoing pandemic situation right now?
Well, you know, I think from my perspective in terms of grief, you know, part of what's difficult when we're facing a loss is that, you know, grief is really confusing. I think, you know, first of all, we need to normalize this grieving process for everybody and just talk about how we all grieve in our own way. And at the same time, you know, my experience of grief is that it comes in waves, and that there are periods where it's confusing how happy one feels and how one can see things that are positive and hopeful. And then at other times when people feel like they should be able to appreciate moments and feel good about things, that sense of loss and that sense of isolation can feel overwhelming. And we may tend to feel like we're just not coping and what's the matter with us. And so part of what's tricky about grief is how unpredictable it is. And I think being able to be gentle with ourselves, acknowledge the waves and ride with them, and be able to face the unpredictability and acknowledge to a certain degree the lack of control that's really inherent in our lives all the time, that really is highlighted by this moment in time, becomes very important. So I think being gentle, appreciating sort of the difficulty of the moment, and being able to sort of accept wherever we are in that process becomes really critical.
I agree with what Steve said. having, I guess, understanding supportive people in your life is also really important in weathering a period of grief. And I think the power of our social connections and just having an empathetic ear is really, really important during these kinds of times. And so, as difficult as it is to try to connect with people during social distancing, I would argue that having social connectivity isn't necessarily like a black and white concept, that there are different ways to communicate with people, and there are different ways to communicate how much you really care. And particularly during these times, I appreciate the all hands on deck sort of methodology that a lot of communities are using. And again, channeling some creative ways to connect with our youth. So very important things to remember in terms of how to navigate these very difficult times and to try to make sure that people have a sense that they're not alone. Thanks.
Dr. Suss, thank you. And we even got some feedback from one of the attendees, just really helpful for them, for you to share that all familiar Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid. And they said it's a great reminder for all of us and our students about the importance of having those basic needs met. I know it began as kind of like, as you implied, something found on the internet, but not so much an access issue, but really what we're finding during this time is it's an equity issue for our students. And so thank you for bringing that up, and at more than one level, it rang true for us. So really appreciate that. This question goes out, Monica, if I can have you turn the camera on and maybe you can shed a little bit of light. I know that we've discussed that we're always looking for better ways to equip California's educators, district leaders, policymakers across the state, anyone that's involved somehow in supporting students. And so maybe you could speak just to a little bit of this, but this attendee was interested, are there any plans for webinars that include preparation for educators for the return of students to school and for the very specific social emotional needs to be met by schools at that time? Are you open to sharing a little bit about that, about maybe some future plans for these kinds of training and resources?
Well, there will be now. So we want to make sure that what we're giving you is not what we think that you need, but what you are telling us that you need. And so definitely we will work with Wellness Together and the rest of our partners, and as well as internally, to be able to make sure that we give you that content. So thank you for asking that. That's wonderful. We don't know when that will be. We hope that it will be in the fall, but there's so many things to consider. And so definitely you will get information on how to prepare for when students return to the brick and mortar schools. Thank you.
Monica, thank you very much. And yes, I would agree. If you're watching this in real time, your email address will be added to the listserv, both for Wellness Together School Mental Health, as well as for any of our partners. And so the CDE will be connecting with you rather. And so for more announcements like this, just stay tuned to your inbox, as has become all too familiar for us these days. But definitely want to make sure that whatever the future holds, that we are supporting each other and the roles that we have in supporting families. Dr. Hoover, another question for you. And this was a great one. I imagine that this isn't just the only person that had this question, but could you speak to this, that how does your organization, and what I'm thinking is the Center for School Mental Health, how does CSMH implement Tier 1 supports across schools? Could you share a little bit of that with us, please?
Yeah, so, and I think a second part of the question that came in was about whether or not we use, for example, school-wide positive behavior interventions as supports, or if we have our own curriculum. And the one thing I would emphasize is that the Tier 1 supports that I spoke of today, and the general framework that we talk about as a center and that we implement with in our settings, is in some respects framework benign, or framework neutral may be the better term. And what I mean by that is that the core components of Tier 1 supports are generally what we talk about. So those things that I mentioned today: social emotional learning competencies, positive school climate, teacher well-being, mental health literacy for students, crisis preparedness. And we know that many districts and even states really embrace certain frameworks, whether it be PBIS, MTSS, interconnected systems frameworks. We have lots of acronyms and frameworks. And then all of these components, we tend to speak about the components of Tier 1 rather than a specific framework. We know it can very much help if you have a framework and a district team set up. But the framework that we tend to use are the core components. And then if we had a framework that we ascribe to, it would be more just the national standards for comprehensive school mental health systems, which are outlined in the guidance document that I mentioned early on at schoolmentalhealth.org. And also the performance standards are on theshapesystem.com. So folks can find them there. And they really are, again, framework neutral. So those standards would align with any of those multi-tiered system frameworks.
Excellent, thank you. And if you wouldn't mind, I see it's very helpful actually that you shared about a 4-part webinar series that NCSMH is going to be sharing. Can you go into that a little bit? It sounds like that could help meet a need for, when students kind of reintegrate back into schools.
Yep. So we, like Monica said, don't have our 4th date planned. We've worked with some of our national partners. The first one will be on suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention, because that's one of the areas we're getting the most technical assistance requests. And our second will be all on Tier 1 supports, our third on Tier 2, Tier 3 supports. And then finally, and in part it's because of the unpredictability and uncertainty right now, as Monica alluded to, we don't know when that 4th webinar will occur, but we're already having a lot of folks really thinking about what are the anticipated needs in terms of workforce development? How do we better support our staff? I heard today from one district who is implementing a triage system for their educators of how they can access different behavioral health supports over the summertime to best prepare them for the school year and reopening. So we'll keep you updated on when we're having that 4th webinar, but we anticipate covering topics like how do you identify and support students with traumatic stress exposure and grief and loss, and also how do you instill a sense of hope and optimism and readiness for the new school year.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much. And thanks to all of our panelists and partners here, part of this webinar. Dr. Hoover, really appreciate you giving of your time. Dr. Adelsheim and Dr. Suss, thank you for presenting. We'll make sure all those resources get in the appropriate folders. And I'll share my screen here as we close out. There's still quite a few of you that have still attended, so thanking you from all of us here at Wellness Together School Mental Health and the California Department of Education. Here's those helpful links for you on the way out. All the resources, there's the folder, bit.ly/supporting you, supporting students. Would love to hear feedback and ways that we can help improve this experience for you. And that's that second link, bit.ly/SYSS feedback. If you have any questions, you can continue to submit them there. And finally, a recording of this will be available if you know someone who this would have been very helpful for them, or another team maybe, that this could be some useful resources for them, that you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, just Wellness Together, or visit our website, wellnesstogether.org/events, and pass that along to them. Again, there's going to be a bonus episode if you joined us late. We're going to have a 4th part of this 3-part series next Thursday at 1 p.m. We're very excited for Dr. Stephen Brock to present for a full 90 minutes. And you might be familiar with the PREPARE model for school crisis intervention and prevention. And he'll be talking to us on how to best support each other in the midst of dealing with a school crisis or dealing with crises while the whole world is trying to navigate and manage the situation. So hope you can make that a part of your schedule next week. If you're already registered for this, if you're hearing and seeing this in real time, then you're already registered for it. No need to do anything. And if you know someone who would be beneficial for them to be a part of it, send them to wellnesstogether.org/events to register. And yes, that will be recorded as well. So whether this finds you in some corner of the place where you live, or a desk just 8 feet from where you sleep, or a car, or some place that maybe is a little unfamiliar, maybe it's slowly becoming familiar, thank you for the work that you're doing in supporting schools. Thank you to Blue Shield of California and the California Department of Education for their partnership, helping put this to you. We will see you next week. Thanks again for what you do. Take care and all the best. Bye-bye.